Hello out there, all you wonderful people. This is Andre, the Game Idea Guy. Thank you once again for lending me your time and your ear listening into another What If discussion from me. And it's the first one of 2022. Hopefully there will be more. So for this discussion, I'm going to do the opposite of what I think is my most viewed What If discussion. And that is, what if the 32X was the follow-up to the Genesis instead of the Sega Saturn? Now, for this particular scenario, we're going to have to completely eliminate the Sega Saturn, and the 32X was Sega's next intentional step in hardware development. Now, this would be a two-pronged approach. You'd have the 32X unit that locks in on your Sega Genesis, that comes with all the connectors and cords, that I believe launched between 150 and 170. So it's still an upgrade to the Sega Genesis. And then there would also be a standalone model that launches at $225. And I'm only giving that price because I want it to somewhere between $200 to $225 because I'm looking at it being a $50 difference. Now, Sega may not have picked those prices, but that's just what I'm giving for this scenario. So people who had their Sega Genesis would not have to get rid of it. They could just upgrade to the next platform and keep their Genesis. And the 32X is already backwards compatible with everything the Genesis does because it uses the same equipment. So either you get the actual 32X unit that plugs into the Genesis and that's how you move forward into the next generation, or you get the standalone unit that is still automatically backwards compatible with the Sega Genesis, and that would still have the port in order to connect it to the Sega CD unit. So it's fully backwards compatible with everything the Genesis has. Firstly, this allows Sega to use a lot less resources, a lot less money on development. Secondly, without the Sega Saturn being worked on at the same time, it's a lot less confusing for the consumers. Third, Sega will come into issue with cartridges and not having enough memory on board on cartridges for the 32X standalone, which was the same situation that Nintendo found themselves in with the N64 for some game titles. But Nintendo worked around that by working on ways to compress. Now, if Sega would do that, I do not know. I think that they would attempt it, but I have no clue that they would actually do it. But I do instead think that they would keep use of the Sega CD drive and possibly produce more of them, maybe even lowering the price so that more people can get them. And then they would utilize the complete hardware package to very similarly get the effect of the Sega Saturn, but just not quite. It wouldn't quite be on par with that because the 32X only had one of those CPU chips versus the Sega Saturn having two, which means it has a lot less processing capability. So it wouldn't exactly be there, but it would be similar enough. So take, for instance, you do get a 32X game, or you get a Sega CD game that is upgraded by the 32X being there. So like there's a cartridge that goes into the 32X that comes with the newly bundled Sega CDs. And it goes into the 32X to open up the bandwidth and memory of the 32X to the Sega CD. Meaning that those games would be 32X CD games. Like there were several that were made, and they would be higher quality and run better than just plain Sega CD games. And on top of that, this combination could also boost the loading times and speeds of Sega CD games as it were. Again, fully backwards compatible. And on top of that, that would also add to the color palettes and all that. Like every advantage that the 32X gave to Sega Genesis cartridges would be translated over to Sega CD disc as well as 32X CD disc. I know I'm saying a lot. I'm giving a whole lot of mouthfuls here, but this process has to be done because I have to think how it would work. Now, Sega would also still be working on an analog controller. So we would get an analog controller very similar to the Sega Saturn analog controller. Might even be physically exactly the same outside of the way that it connects to the console. And I do believe that 3D games would still occur with this combination. So we probably would still get Virtual Fighter. We'd probably still get Virtual Cop. Probably very likely still get Nights into Dreams, get stuff like Bug. They just would be downscaled versions of what they were. No, every 32X game that came out would still happen. Also, I think that in this particular situation, we get a Sonic CD 2. I know someone's going to think that that's just an odd thing to consider, but I think that they would, oddly enough, make a continuation after Sonic CD in which Knuckles is a playable character, and they would use the Knuckles Chaotix sprites. So Sonic and Tails will get updated sprites as well and get their sprites made in that styling and put into this game. But instead of time travel, they would take from the comics. And I think at this point, the comics, you had Evil Sonic and Anti-Mobius. So pulling from the comics back in the day, they would have done dimension hopping instead of time travel. So you could have Evil Sonic and Robotnik teaming up together to beat Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles. But Evil Sonic would have the Anarchy barrels and have his super form to match Sonic getting the Chaos Emeralds and having his super form. Or Sonic or Tails or Knuckles having it. And for instance, if you have Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and you have that, and I would make it so that I would think that they would make it so that this slot would have an opening to put the Sega Genesis cartridges on top, because you still need to be able to have access to the RAM cards of the Sega CD utilizing it. So, having that slot be available, you could tack that on and include the Super Emeralds in this game so that Tails would be able to get his super form, and you'd have additional content be able to be unlocked within the game because of something you already had previously. I'd also think that a lot of games that were popular back then for Sega would have had their continuations on this platform. So say we had Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3. A Streets of Rage collection would be modified and put on this platform, and then there would be a totally different version of Streets of Rage 4 released to it. Also, as odd as it might sound, Sonic Extreme probably would have happened. And they may have stuck with that fish-eyed look, and it would have been possible to do with this hardware combination, though performance-wise it probably would have run a little bit slower. I don't think it would have been looking as good as what it was for the Sega Saturn hardware. Again, part of the processing capability is taken away. And Sega CD, while adding to that, doesn't add as much. But this platform could still get games like Street Fighter Alpha, Street Fighter Alpha 2, possibly 3, depending on how far along it goes. And if Sony's still inspired Sega by making the 3D console, which I think would, because Sega, for some damn reason back then, didn't have good forethought. So with that considered, and taking that into the situation, that's why I think that they would definitely leave the slot open to add in the Sega CD, because again, they could use it to boost the processing capability by having all the parts working together. So you'd have the CPU and stuff of the 32X, and then that of the Sega Genesis, and then that of the Sega CD, because they all had their own processors. All of that working together to create this device. And then, again, the standalone also connecting to the Sega CD units, encompassing all of the same things. But a lot of the arcade games that Capcom released could still be released on this platform. I think, though, even that would also probably encourage Capcom to re-release all of their Mega Man games on this particular platform. They maybe not re-release them, but then again, maybe Mega Man X or Mega Man X4 would be released on this, because I do think that it would be capable of 32-bit graphics, or at the very least, it would be comparable to the Neo Geo. So somewhere between 24 and 32-bit. And I do think that 3D would be part of that. You would likely see games like Alone in the Dark, Space Hawk be on this. Potentially Soccer Kid or Kid Cleat, depending on, I think, which platform you played it on. So I do think that this would also fit into the role of what the 32X did. Not 32X, 3DO did. But again, because Sega's more well known, it would probably take off way better. So think of like stuff like Gex and all that stuff that all came out on the Sega Saturn. A lot of those 2D classic games, that stuff would still come out as disc-based games for the Sega CD 32X combination, or the 32X CD as it would be called. For the cartridges, just 32X, but for the disc, 32X CD. And I think that they would start off with utilizing the cartridge format first, mostly because Sega at the time, or at least Sega of America, thought that that was a good idea. And again, it left open backwards compatibility with the Sega Genesis. But eventually they would move more toward producing more and more disc-based games because they would be cheaper to produce. And on top of that, the disc at the time had more space to them. Now, I do think if Sega was savvy enough in this situation, they would have it so that any of the 32X games or the Sega Genesis games that you had in your collection could enhance and unlock features for the disc-based games, because the whole platform communicates together. That is something that they could potentially have done, which is what Nintendo was looking into with utilizing the N64 DD. So maybe even if Final Fantasy VII itself didn't end up on this platform, there may have been Final Fantasy games that ended up on it, or even Sega deciding, hey, we're going to continue Phantasy Star on this console, as well as how they did with Shining Force, because they continued Shining Force into the Sega Saturn, as well as Shinobi. So having those games available and then be like, okay, well, if you have this game, you lock the cartridge on, you unlock this particular item or this costume or something, or you unlock these stages that wouldn't be available to the game otherwise. It would be a smart business move, and on top of that, would be something that I think would have made people enthusiastic about this platform, because then you don't have to get rid of the stuff that you already had, and two, you have new stuff that you get bonuses for being loyal to their branding, which is would have been an excellent and smart business move back then, I believe. We may have seen a sequel to Eternal Champions, which was a really good fighting game for the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD. Something that Sega has not brought back yet. Let's see, I could just see it being very decently successful in the long run. Maybe not as popular as the 64 or the PlayStation. I highly doubt it would be as popular as those because of the many different configurations that you could have. But I do think it wouldn't have been as poorly received as how the Sega Saturn was when they rushed it out. And mostly the Saturn was poorly received just because it was rushed. But also, if Sega had the time and they had the SDKs and everything ready, they'd be good to go. But I do believe that this Chimera console would have at least kept Sega from taking the dip that they did with the Sega Saturn. That's really my whole point. Now, the Dreamcast probably would still exist. I would be hopeful that Sega would not do what they did with the controller and lessen the amount of buttons like they did for the Dreamcast, because that was not a good idea. And I also meant to say I do think that they would have introduced trigger buttons with an updated 6-button controller, like the one that the Sega Saturn had versus the Sega Genesis one. I meant to say that and completely forgot it. But that should have been included with the analog. So just bear with me. I accidentally skipped the point. But I do think that eventually a machine like the Dreamcast would have existed. How similar it would have been, I do not know. But Sega would have gone into this machine with a better standing in gaming in general had they gone this route and taken their time and been patient and just worked on what they knew they had coming. They would have had better ties to third parties, and the general gaming audience and retailers probably would have treated them better as well. Now, if this would have come with a lot of the awesome games that the Dreamcast had, I do not know. Because so many games happened on the Dreamcast because Sega was being abandoned by most of the Western third parties. So they made studios and ended up doing their own games because of it, like NFL 2K and NBA 2K. I don't know if those games would exist or not. They may, but I can't say for sure if Sega's in good standing with EA and and companies like 989 and stuff. I think they still existed around then. I don't know if they would particularly want to make games to cover those genres if there are third parties already making games. So we may actually have lost out on the 2K games. There's just an example. I don't know for sure. But stuff like, and I skipped over this, but stuff like all the Marvel superheroes stuff, Marvel superheroes, X-Men stuff, and X-Men versus Street Fighter, Marvel superheroes versus Street Fighter and stuff. Those all those games could still happen on the Sega 32X CD. And we likely would have still gotten Marvel vs. Capcom on this Dreamcast and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Now, if these games would be the same, again, there's likely going to be some tweaks to them. I couldn't say for sure. And also games like Zombies Revenge and like House of the Dead and stuff. Sorry, hiccup there. Those probably would still exist and mostly in the same fashion and function. But I do think that this would be a healthier Sega going forward. Now, here's where the twist I think would probably happen, and that's like if Sega was having this decent level of success going forward, this is where I think they might get cocky and do some things that would probably backfire on them. Now, what those things are, I don't know particularly, but I do think that part of it was just like what happened with the Dreamcast when they had a bunch of really good games. They forgot to keep the classics up, and that was a huge problem. Like outside of Sonic and House of the Dead, they didn't really have a whole lot of their classic games make the transition over. Yeah, Virtual Fighter did. I think Fighting Vipers 2 happened, or that may not have actually launched. I don't remember. But a lot of that stuff may have been forgotten about, and I think that that could have been a major problem for Sega. Because then the audiences that were looking forward to those games never got to see those games return, and they didn't come back. But this I think would be where they kind of got a little overconfident because they had at least a decent run and a decent streak. Now, I don't think this would take them out of the console game, but I do think it would hit them enough that they would come with a follow-up and be like, okay, we have to do better this time than we did the last. So following their Dreamcast-esque system, and I think in particular they would partner with SNK or Neo Geo, same company basically. They would partner with them and have them work on doing the handheld. I think that this is where that would come into play because they didn't, at this point, didn't have a decent handheld to compete with Nintendo's handhelds. And that would be where they place all of their handheld games and stuff of that nature. Maybe even try to upgrade their stuff and compete with the likes of Sony and maybe Microsoft if they have moved into the market at this point. Because we know that they were looking into doing it. We just don't know how they would have done it. And I don't think that they would have worked with Sega. If Sega was healthy, I don't think they would have worked with Sega at this point. They may have worked with the same company that did 3DO. And I would have said Panasonic, but Panasonic was just one of the versions of 3DO because there was Panasonic, there was a Magnavox one, and then there was a totally different one that connected to a PC to be able to play 3DO games. So yeah, that was all over the place. But I think Microsoft would have worked with the companies, or the company that originally set the 3DO up in order to come up with their own console. Again, I have no idea how the console would look or how it would work. And I think this would be even more like PC than the original Xbox was. And it might even just come with a mouse and keyboard for gaming. Now, I do think it would have its own controllers. They could potentially look like what we got with the original Xbox. But I have no clue for sure. But I think that those would be something you'd have to purchase separately, whereas most of their games would be designed to run off of this PC console that would be connected to your TV instead of a monitor. And they would, again, potentially bring all of the same services and stuff that they did and that they popularized, because that was something that they were looking forward to do. Now, Sega and Nintendo would likely have kept on the paths that they were already on. We'd get the GameCube and the PS2. The Xbox would probably be a different machine if it showed up, and Sega's Dreamcast of this era would be a different machine also. Nintendo would likely still move on to make the Wii. I have no idea if Sony would make the PS3 the same way. Obviously, there would be a PS3, but I just don't think it would be the same machine. And then the next Xbox, which we don't know if it would be called the 360, would be made, and Sega would, again, I don't know what they would make here. In my last What If, where the Saturn was successful, I went with the name Neptune, forgetting that that was just another version of the Saturn. So, if Sega went with Dreamcast, then this next system would probably be a callback to their older console, and they probably just may name this one the Master System or the Master Console. I don't know for sure, but they could possibly go ahead and say, we'll roll it back because that's where we feel we are. Now, here, because these variables have changed so much, I have no clue where this would go. I have no inkling as to where this would go. But I do know it would be interesting. I have a distinct feeling that this would be a very, very interesting period to be witness to and to be part of, because this would be a totally different seventh generation. I don't think that Sega would go the power route like Microsoft and Sony did. I do think that Sony would go that direction. I just think the PS3 would be different. And I'm pretty sure the Wii would still be the same. But I don't know what Sega's overall gimmick would be. Now, I assumed the last time it would be that they would have a portable, not a portable, but a controller with a screen on it to be a continuation of what they had started with the Dreamcast, where the memory cards had the screen on them and they could be inserted into the controller. But being that everybody would have onboard memory and things that dry throat, onboard memory and things of that nature, I do see Sega trying to be a step above Nintendo. So if the Wii came out and it was a 480p console, then Sega would likely come out with their console, make it a 540p console, which would allow it to utilize HD TVs a little bit better, and the games would look a little bit crisper, but it wouldn't be as expensive as in development cost as both Microsoft and Sony's 7th generation consoles. And everybody at this point has online functionality, whether they start out with it or it comes later on down the line. But if Sega was still trying to attempt to do the SegaNet thing, I think they would have partnered with Nintendo to try to make this come into fruition. So Nintendo's online service might not have been on GameSpy at the time. They might have worked with Sega to set stuff up so that they had games that were, one, cross-platform between the two of them, and two, so that they could actually start rivaling their characters against each other. Oddly enough, Mario and Sonic might have actually still happened, but we probably would have had two different versions of it. There would have been the version that worked with the Wii, that worked with the motion controls of the Wii Remote Nunchuck, and then there could have been a version of it that worked with the Master System. We'll just call it Master System 2. That would have been based on utilizing a touchscreen controller or multiple touchscreen controllers that are plugged into the unit. And that could have been the way that they work things out. And that would mean, like, with shooters and stuff, you'd have Wii Remote and Nunchuck against dual stick, but having a touchscreen controller. Wouldn't be the best touchscreen because it would be similar to the touchscreen of the DS, but it would still be a usable touchscreen, I think. And I could see a lot of the same games being on both of these platforms, just with different play styles. So, again, Nintendo and Sega rivaling each other and sticking to trying to take on each other, but also working with each other at the same time. Which probably would have, at this point, probably would have been a good boon for Sega, and probably would have helped them sell better. And they, in this scenario, I could see them taking second or third place at the end of the generation, because we know Nintendo won first. I don't see them outdoing the Wii because of the Wii's ability to be utilized by a wider margin of people. But I think with the nostalgia and the potential fact that Sega and Nintendo could be working together, it will likely help them. So, beyond that, I have no true idea of how it would work. I just know that it would be an interesting scenario, and I would love to have lived in this world that I just created. Because there would be a ton of games that we get to play that would exist that we don't have. But there would probably be so many trade-offs and so many things lost that would just kind of suck. But Bayonetta would probably be exclusive to this, because I doubt that Bayonetta wouldn't happen. But again, these are opinions. But you can give me your thoughts on how you feel about this scenario that I've come up with. I mean, I tried to think it through, like, step by step, but there are so many variables that change from one place to the next. It's like, that was a little difficult to predict. But knowing how the companies were, I think some of the things that I said make some sense. Not everything, but some of the things. And I do see that. I do see the idea of Sega doing potentially well in this world, but I think probably by 8th generation, they may have still gone third party. And I only say that because Sega, even though they were well loved and liked back then, they didn't make as much money as everybody. They didn't make as much money as everybody else. Now, I could be wrong. I could highly be wrong. But I think that they would eventually have been like, okay, the console market is not worth it for us. This would be our last big thing, and we'll probably come up with one last big game, and then we're moving on to being a third party. I could be right, I could be wrong, but I'd hope I'm wrong in that situation. But again, thank you guys very much for listening again. Keep your eyes and ears out for more stuff from me. And until the next time, enjoy your games and peace out, everybody. And please leave your opinions down below.